homeless population has exploded in the United States in recent years, certainly during the pandemic, where we have seen encampments grow larger and suffering on honestly every street corner in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco. One thing that's undeniable, though, is the prevalence of severe mental illness and also deaths from drug overdoses. These are things that are studied, these are things that are provable through data. Yet it's something that seems to be ignored by the very advocates who claim to care about the well-being and welfare of those who end up on the streets. So let's take a look at the numbers. The Los Angeles Times examined more than 4,000 questionnaires taken as part of 2019's point-in-time count and found that about 76% of individuals living outside on the streets reported being or were observed to be affected by mental illness, substance abuse, poor health, or a physical disability. Now that is a broad range of categories, as you can see, right? So let's get a little more specific. Individually, substance abuse affects 46% of those living on the streets, more than 3 times the rate previously reported. And mental illness, including post-traumatic stress disorder, affects 51% of those living on the streets, according to the analysis. And as we've shared on the show before, the number of drug overdoses has also exploded, especially during the pandemic. It is incredibly heartbreaking. And these numbers I'm about to share with you are actually a little outdated. They're from 2019, but here's what we know. Drug overdoses have been the leading cause of death among the homeless in Los Angeles County since 2017, increasing 84% between 2016 and 2019. According to the county, a person experiencing homelessness is 36 times more likely to die of a drug overdose than a person in the general population. Now, recently in San Francisco, Mayor London Breed declared a state of emergency over drug overdose deaths among the city's homeless. In fact, drug-related fatalities are on the rise and outpaced COVID deaths in the city last year by 2 to 1. This is real, this is happening. But for some reason, just bringing this up tends to be one of the most taboo things you could imagine online. Ignoring this problem doesn't make it go away. And I also want to be fair to the advocates who are a little afraid of talking about these issues. They're worried about stigmatizing, they're worried about stereotyping, and I think that that is a legitimate concern to have. But unless we actually address the reality on the ground, unless we can properly diagnose what the issue is, we're not able to provide the services or the solutions necessary to keep people healthy and alive. Simply allowing people to die on our sidewalks is not acceptable. It is not. And that is what's happening in Los Angeles. That is what's happening in San Francisco. And I'm tired of pretending like it's not happening. I'm tired of pretending like just offering housing is the only solution. We need to do more than that. Yes, housing is a problem. I have addressed that on the show many, many times, but that is not the only problem. And that's why I want to talk about this today. The Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, which conducts its own annual report, interpreted the data to produce much lower numbers. So they do their own. And so when you compare the Los Angeles Times and its analysis to the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, you'll notice a significant difference. In its presentation of the results to elected officials, the agency said only 29% of the homeless population had either a mental illness or substance abuse disorder, and therefore 71% did not have a serious mental illness and or report substance use disorder. For example, and this is the methodology that they use, disclosures of having serious mental illness, depression, or PTSD were counted only if they also answered a secondary question stating that it was permanent or long-term. That omission reduced the mental illness rate by 11.4 percentage points. And remember, we're talking about surveys that are being answered by the homeless population. Any survey that relies on a person to answer about him or herself is gonna have some human error involved. And the methodology here for the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority is a little flawed if you ask me. So let me give you some more data, because it's not just the Los Angeles Times and its own analysis that found found higher numbers. UCLA actually did its own study into this, and they found even higher numbers. So let's take a look at this graph that compares the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, the Los Angeles Times, and UCLA. When it comes to mental illness, as you can see, UCLA has far higher numbers. 78% of the homeless population, according to UCLA, has a mental health issue. The Los Angeles Times had it at 51%, and then you have the Homeless Authority, Services Authority at 25%. And so you can see the numbers there. When it comes to substance abuse, UCLA has higher numbers than the Los Angeles Times. And so there's just this weird disconnect happening, and it's incredibly frustrating to see it because, again, this is more than just a housing issue. We need to provide mental health services. We need to focus on drug rehabilitation. And so I came across a book that was recommended to me by a friend, and I had a knee-jerk reaction to it. Didn't like the title, just gonna keep it real. But then I forced myself to read it. And after reading it, I realized that there were valid points that I wanted to discuss with the author. So joining me now is Michael Schellenberger, author of San Francisco, Why Progressives Ruin Cities. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Anna.
So Michael, I actually want to start off discussing just briefly the title of your book, because I've read your book, and in it, I think you make an important point, an important distinction in terms of what is being advocated for by homeless advocates, which is really this libertarian policy. So on one hand, you define it as libertarian, but then you blame it on progressivism, at least in your title, and then a little bit throughout your book as well. Why do you do that?
Sure, and let me just start by saying that I come from the radical left. In the late 1990s, I worked for George Soros's foundation to advocate drug decriminalization. I worked with Maxine Waters to advocate needle exchange, organizing civil rights leaders. I still support the decriminalization of marijuana. I have always favored a rehabilitation approach rather than a criminal justice approach, and I still believe that. I also support more housing. In fact, I wrote a column in 2019 calling for more housing, an emergency declaration by the governor of California for more housing. But as soon as I did, I had a number of people email me and say, hey, you can't just describe the people living in open drug scenes, what we call homeless encampments on Skid Row in LA or the Tenderloin in San Francisco, as simply not being able to afford the rent. This is a problem that's driven by drug addiction and untreated mental illness. I interviewed one of the major homeless service providers in Los Angeles what percentage of people he thought living on the streets were suffering from substance use disorder, which is what we call addiction these days. And he said 100%. And I thought that sounded crazy high. So I thought maybe he was conservative. So I interviewed a very progressive woman who became a character, a real person, Susan Partovi, harm reduction advocate, works with people on the streets. And I asked her, and she said 100%. She said people don't come to live here if they can't afford the rent. People come here for the open drug scene, which is people living in the open air drug market. So there's definitely a housing part of this, but I think we're doing a disservice to people suffering late stage addiction and untreated mental illness to suggest that they're on the street because they couldn't afford the rent. People who can't afford the rent, as you know, millions of people can't afford the rent in California and have moved out of state or moved into a lower rent apartment or moved in with friends and family. The folks that end up on the street overwhelmingly are people who, because of their addiction and untreated mental illness, ended up on the street.
And look, I see it anecdotally just by living in Los Angeles and experiencing it firsthand. But anecdotal evidence is not really indicative of a larger trend. But then you look at the data and you see a larger trend. And so talk to me a little bit about the response that you're seeing from local lawmakers in California, which of course is being fueled by activism and organizing on the ground, and why you have deemed it, and I think this is an accurate interpretation, a libertarian rather than a progressive approach.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a huge response. So San Francisco came out 3 months ago. By the way, I still identify as a liberal, and I'm an independent, not a Democrat, certainly not a Republican. But there's been a huge change. The mayor of San Francisco, London Breed, called for a major crackdown on open air drug use and drug dealing in mid-December. We've now seen the two progressive Democratic frontrunners for the mayor's race in Los Angeles, Karen Bass, a longtime community organizer, as well as Kevin De Leon, come out for very strong policies to basically end what we call unsheltered homelessness, which is camping on the streets in open drug scenes. Everybody wants to see a treatment first approach, but we're now seeing a very significant shift from a housing first approach, which is the idea that we're gonna just provide apartment units for everybody who wants one at a cost of around $750,000 to $1 million per unit to people in the most expensive housing real estate areas of the United States. We're moving from that, which is obviously unrealistic. I think that's been shown by the reality on the ground, to a shelter first approach. I think most of us who are on the left or even the center left, I think believe that people do have a right to shelter. It's immoral to let people sleep on the street. But that doesn't mean that we can provide everybody with their own apartment in Venice Beach or Beverly Hills or downtown LA. There are limits to that. It creates perverse incentives. You don't have to be a dogmatic, conservative, free market libertarian to know that that's just not gonna work. The cost is just too high. California is lucky to be the 5th largest economy in the world. We have a $30 billion budget surplus. We could have, Anna, the same high quality psychiatric and addiction care that Amsterdam, the Netherlands has, and which I use as the case study for San Francisco. There's no reason that we couldn't be world class in our treatment of our most suffering fellow friends and family. My aunt suffered from schizophrenia. She did okay in a residential home. We can do so much better than letting people live in their own filth, drug addicted and dying in tents on the street.
Yeah, I actually want to add a little more to what you're saying in regard to the housing situation, because California voters overwhelmingly voted in favor of a ballot initiative known as HHH. They voted to raise their own taxes in order to pay for housing for the homeless. And so everyone's heart is in the right place. But what ended up happening with that funding is real estate developers who do the construction for the housing inflated the construction costs to line their own pockets. And we've seen very few affordable homes or houses or apartment units built as a result of that increase in our own taxes. It's been a complete and utter disaster. I mean, it ended up being a way to do sweetheart deals with the real estate developers that are, funding the campaigns of local politicians in California. It's absolutely disgusting. But getting back to what you were saying about mental health treatment, I'm noticing something that it's contradictory. So on one hand, I think that progressives rightly point to the mistakes made by the Reagan administration in California in essentially cutting off access or shutting down access to mental health facilities in the state. And then now it's fascinating because while they simultaneously say that, they'll also mention, well, you can't force people into mental health treatment. You have to have individuals consent to it. But you run into a problem when you're dealing with individuals who have severe mental health issues, right? So we're talking about people who might be paranoid schizophrenics, individuals who might not have the mental capacity due to their mental health illness to consent. So what do you do about that situation? Because that does bring up a tricky and uncomfortable, conundrum.
Yeah, I think that's a really important issue. I mean, nobody loves their freedom more than I do. I live in California because I love my freedom. I don't like the stuffiness and conservativeness on the East Coast. So we want that freedom. We don't want people to be put in psychiatric hospitals or into rehab if they don't have any serious problem. I think the bottom line is that people should be free to smoke fentanyl and meth in the privacy of their own homes if they would like to do that. I think it's crazy. Those are very dangerous and deadly drugs. But I don't think that taxpayers have an interest in chasing down people that are doing so, nor do I think that people that are suffering mental illness but are following the laws should be subject to the coercive powers of the state. On the other hand, if you're camping in public, defecating in public, using drugs in public, dealing drugs in public, you're breaking the law. That's a cry for help, and we need to respond by offering people the choice of psychiatric and/or addiction care or jail. I think people will sometimes get the idea that somehow we're just throwing a lot of people for drug possession into prison for many years. Only 14% of the people in state prisons are there for drugs, only 2% for nonviolent drug offenses. For the most part, these are laws that we simply aren't enforcing at all, including for meth and fentanyl. But when people are breaking those laws and they're clearly in signs of serious distress, I don't even really like to describe many of the things that I've seen. I kept a lot of information out of the book because it was of such a violent and sexual nature that I just felt like it was hard for people to read. But when people are engaged in those behaviors, we don't let our fellow humans do that to themselves. And when they're breaking laws, that's the chance to intervene and provide them the care they need. And they're still free, obviously if they can satisfy, a court psychiatrist to go to jail if they would rather do that. But if people are out of their minds thinking that they're communicating with aliens or they've got implants in their brain from the CIA, which happen to be two very oddly common delusions, we need to recognize that they are not sane. We have longstanding common law and other laws to govern how we deal with people that are out of their minds, and it would be immoral to put those people in prison or jail when they clearly are not in command of their basic functions.
Do you have any concerns about what continues to be I don't even want to be generous in describing it, but I mean, our criminal justice system is certainly flawed. I personally have been physically attacked. It just happened a few weeks ago by the thing that happened 2 weeks ago was with two very clearly under the influence individuals. As I was walking my dog, I was picking up his poo, and as I was doing it, one of the guys grabbed me by my waist and shook me, and it was terrifying because I had no way of protecting myself. I didn't know what to do. Luckily, they went away after that and didn't do anything else. But that was the fourth incident that I've now had, and I never think to call the police because police clearly don't have the training necessary to deal with someone who might be having some sort of mental health issue, or they're in the middle of psychosis because of some hard drug that they're on. So there's like this issue with the solution that you're calling for, because the very system that we would rely on to deal with this is a system that has deep flaws and is known to use excessive force and abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's really, people have to understand that we have sort of two choices: mass incarceration or mass homelessness. If we don't want those, and I certainly don't want either of them, then we need to really lean into three things. I call them the three key Ps: policing, psychiatry, and probation. Sometimes when I point out there was a lot of misinformation about Portugal. I interviewed the head of Portugal's drug program, and I said, what would happen if you're shooting heroin in public in Lisbon or Portugal? And he said, you would be arrested. You'd be brought to the police station. Arresting people is not the same thing as throwing them in prison. You can arrest people and get them the care they need. It just means to stop them and intervene in some action. So if you have better policing, you both deter crimes, you also get people the help that they need when they need it. If we do more in terms of psychiatry, then we can get people the help they need. Antipsychotics now are quite good. They last a long time. That minimizes the need to be in prison. And then finally, probation. It allows for kind of constant checking in. What we see in places like the Netherlands and Portugal, which are very progressive in their approach to drugs and mental illness, is you see the police becoming more like social workers, and social workers becoming a bit more firm. It's not anything goes. There's consequences for behavior. There's also rewards for good behavior. So there is a role for subsidized housing. I support a strong role for subsidized housing, but it's as a reward for people making progress on their personal plan, either in terms of getting off hard drugs, taking psychiatric meds that they need, getting a job, getting independence, which is really what we should hope for everybody. But it's not just giving people housing as an entitlement. Shelter is an entitlement. Housing is something that's earned. And I think the final part of this that I think most of my progressive and liberal friends understand is absolutely necessary. We need universal psychiatry. We needed it like yesterday. This should be an entitlement. This should be a right. I have actually found a significant amount of support among left, right, and center for significant improvements to psychiatric and addiction care. It needs to be a universal service. We can afford it. We're a rich country. Anybody who wants single payer or socialized medicine and healthcare, we should start with psychiatry, because we are in the midst of a very serious psychiatric and drug addiction emergency right now.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. Final question for you. Is there any movement toward that? Because there's a lot of work to do in order for the solutions you're proposing to work. On one hand, there's the policing issue, which desperately needs to be reformed. And I would argue that in order to reform policing, you actually have to use a little more funding and ensure that you're hiring the right people, you're training the right people. And then on the other hand, when it comes to universal psychiatry, I mean, that takes a considerable amount of resources as well. You're correct in stating that a place like California has the resources necessary to make it happen. But I'm curious, is there any movement working toward that as we speak?
Very significant movement. And in fact, there's been a really lovely history, a secret history in some ways, or little known history of Republicans and Democrats working together to expand mental health care. It's an issue that had been shrouded in shame and taboo for many decades. But there is a law in the books that says that we need what's called so-called parity in terms of health insurance providers, including the government, providing equal treatment for mental health issues as well as physical health issues. The system hasn't responded in the way that it needs to, in part because we've just got some very radical libertarian demands that people not face consequences for their behaviors when they are suffering mental illness. They need consequences for their behavior for mental illness. When people with schizophrenia are engaged in taking off all their clothes or violently attacking people, whether it's from schizophrenia or from meth, there need to be consequences because that's how people get their help. So I've seen a significant amount of support on the right from groups like Manhattan Institute, American Enterprise Institute, on the left from Brookings Institution, Center for American Progress. All of these groups want to see a significant expansion of psychiatric care. We saw that President Biden has just announced a major increase, a proposed increase in funding for the police. You're absolutely right. If you're narrowly concerned around police violence, you should want more police. The evidence shows that you need more police, not fewer, to reduce violence. One of the things that we discovered that's extraordinary, nobody knows, is that Europeans spend more money on police and have more police per capita than we have in the United States. So there's a perception sometimes that we over-police ourselves. It's not the case. So I think we're seeing significant movement. I think we're seeing big bipartisan agreement that defunding the police was a bad idea. We need to refund the police and we need to improve policing, absolutely. But that means you need more police so you can have more time for trainings. You got to have more police to weed out the bad apples. And then I think we need to see expanded use of probation. Nobody wants to use electronic monitors or drug testing if you don't have to, but those are certainly much better alternatives than locking people up in prison. It means that people can be at home with their families even after they've committed sometimes even serious offenses. There's a significant, I believe, a strong amount of middle ground between left and right in these issues. I think now that we're a year and a half since the George Floyd killing, there is more willingness on both sides to pursue these really sensible middle ground approaches that when you really look at them, it's hard to figure out whether they're liberal or conservative or just common sense.
Yeah, and I would say, it's not just about throwing more money at police departments, but ensuring that they focus on having higher standards in regard to who they hire. I mean, if you look at police departments that have higher standards for education, for instance, they typically have less incidents involving accusations of excessive force, which should be considered an incredibly important job. And the vetting for that job should be far more extensive than what we're seeing now. And I think that it does require more resources in order to push for that type of system as opposed to what we're seeing today. All right, Michael Schellenberger, thank you for being generous with your time and sharing your perspective. And I just want to note, this network is known as a very progressive network, and we gave you a platform to share your perspective. I know,
thank you.
Yes, I know that you were concerned about progressive censoring you, but I think it's important to have these conversations.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the dialogue very much.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.